If you're a children's pastor or a student pastor, I have this idea that I want to run past you. Now, this idea at first might seem a little offensive or maybe a little in your face, but just go with me and let's talk about this for a minute. So here's the idea. Your ministry is small. Okay, now depending on who you are and maybe the ministry that you work with, you might receive that in different ways. You may agree with me that your ministry does seem kind of small, but there's not a lot of kids or so. You might actually have a lot, and that seems kind of offensive to you because your ministry is nothing but small. You have a lot of volunteers to manage, and a lot of kids to manage, and a lot of responsibility on your plate. But I want you to think about this idea of your ministry is small. It seems big, but in the scope of a kid's life, your ministry is actually very short. It's very small. It's a small percentage of the life of that you're investing in the child's totality of their life. There's a couple of statistics that I think we should look at. Here in the United States, there's been some different studies that have been done. And one of the leading studies shows that about more than 80% of adults who have come to faith, adult Christians, actually came to faith when they were kids, before the age of 14. 80%, more than 80%. However, a new study, a more recent study has come out that said that more than 50% of kids growing up in the church who have a relationship with Jesus will walk away from their faith within a year or two after graduating from high school. Like, these are two really important studies to understand that so many kids might come to faith as a child, which kind of points to how important or big our ministry might be. But more than 50% walk away within just a couple years of graduating from high school. You see, what we do in the age group that we lead, it matters. It's very important, but it's small in comparison to the rest of their life. You see, I want you to think about this idea of your ministry being small, because if we have this perspective, it might cause us to think differently about what happens before and after the ministry that we lead. Because it's possible that what happens outside of our ministry, what happens beyond our ministry, after they're done, they grow out of our ministry, or before they come into our ministry, what if that time is actually more important than the ministry that they have in the time that they're with you now? Let me kind of explain it this way. We like to measure ministry. We have lots of different measurements by how we try to measure success and how well we're doing and whether we're growing or not growing. We measure things like attendance. We measure how many kids were there this week compared to this week last month or last year. Or we measure things like salvation or baptisms. How many are we growing? Are more kids coming to faith? Are they growing in their faith? We might measure things by retained visitors who became regular attendees. And these measurements are all good. They're all important. We should be measuring these things. But if we're just measuring these things, I'm concerned that we're thinking small. We're thinking small. There's something actually bigger than what we might need to. And so I want to throw out this crazy idea of measurement. What if we actually measured how many kids who have come to faith in your children's ministry are actually still following Jesus at age 25? Wouldn't that be something amazing that we could measure? Wouldn't that really be a true test of the success of the ministry, of the evangelistic and discipleship processes in your church, if we could measure something like that? Now, logistically, that might be nearly impossible to measure. It's a long-term study. It would take 20 years to study, in some cases, 15 to 20 years, and the average tenure of a children's pastor, student pastor, isn't typically that long, or to hold our attention for that long for that kind of a study. But wouldn't you agree with me that understanding that of are our kids, as they're growing up and entering into the 25s, still retaining the faith that they discovered when they're in a ministry? Don't you agree with me that that's the kind of thing that we should be leaning in toward? The kinds of things that we should be asking, the things that we're trying to investigate? And I think that that's thinking big. And that's thinking bigger than we usually currently think. And I actually think that if churches were to lean into that and think of that, then we might be able to do more for the next generation than we currently do, by leaning outside of the ministries that we're currently overseeing. Now, I didn't introduce myself yet. My name is Kenny Connolly. I am the next generation pastor at Mission Community Church in Gilbert, Arizona. Now, I grew up in ministry. I came to faith as a young boy at the age of 5 or 6 years old, and I actually grew up in children's ministry. It was my children's pastor who is probably the most influential person in my life spiritually. I grew up in his children's ministry, and when I became a teenager, I volunteered in that same ministry. I was very connected to the KidMin, the children's ministry that I was involved in. My first big job right outside of college, I studied to become a children's pastor, and I became a children's pastor at age 18. And that's what the direction of my life was headed towards. But it was actually 8 years in to being a children's pastor that I hit a barrier. I hit a wall. And I finally had a realization of something that I didn't expect. And I experienced the smallness of my ministry. I mean, again, just like you, just like all of us do, we want to think that our ministry is so important, and it is. But I became aware that my ministry that I was leading was far less big than I thought it was. And let me explain the two barriers that I kind of ran into. The first one was I began to experience a frustration of working with a student pastor where we weren't aligned. We had a decent working relationship. We were friends, but we didn't really work that well together. We had a lot of frustrations. And what we found was that the times that we were connecting the most was only when it revolved around kids leaving the children's ministry and going into the student ministry, when my kids became his kids. And we just didn't work. We had a different philosophy of approach and some different things, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But I began to sense a frustration and realizing that all that I had invested in the kids up until that point were no longer anything that I could do about that. It was now the student pastor's responsibility, and I felt some frustration around that, feeling helplessness about that, and even a sense of loss. Now, I also experienced something else within those first couple of years, that first 8 years. I was invited to teach on a Wednesday night, a midweek program to our adults in our church. I was very excited about this, and the topic was already chosen for me. The topic was the importance of children's ministry. And so it was an opportunity for me to cast vision to our parents and to other adults in the auditorium of why children's ministry matters and why they should care, why they should be involved. And I saw it as a great opportunity to recruit more leaders. And I just remember being so excited about sitting down to prepare for this ministry. And I was just going to outline a biblical response for why they should be involved in the children's ministry and why it matters. And I remember sensing the smallness of my ministry, because as I dove into the scripture to find the importance of children's ministry, it had a lot less to do with what I did and so much more with what moms and dads did. And I remember being not disturbed by that, but maybe a little frustrated, because I believed that what I did was so important, and it was, but maybe it was less important than I thought it was. So these were the two first barriers that I encountered. And let me kind of unpack those barriers in a little bit more detail, because I have found over the years that the barriers that I experienced as a young children's pastor were the same barriers that children's pastors and student pastors all across the country and probably all across the world experience these same kinds of things. You know, one of the experiences, the barriers that I hit was the only time that the student pastor and the children's pastor would interact with each other involved the transition of when the kids moved into student ministry. And that seemed to be the only time that it really mattered. And because the student pastor was rarely invested in the children's ministry in the same way the children's pastor really wasn't allowed to be invested in the student ministry. So there seemed to be this barrier there and this frustration and this cutoff, which is not unique to my experience, but to so many other experiences as well. Another experience, a barrier that I ran into with this same student pastor, was that I had some teenagers that served in our children's ministry, but they didn't really participate in the student ministry. It just wasn't a right fit for them, or there wasn't a personality connection, or they didn't have any friends in that ministry. And I remember one week having a sit-down conversation with my student pastor, saying that he didn't want them serving in our children's ministry if they weren't connected in the student ministry. And I remember being very frustrated with that. Like, I completely understood. I wanted for those students to actually be connected in their own group, in a Sunday school class, or in a ministry where they're being connected with peers and things like that. But I also realized that not every kid fits in some ways. And sometimes the connection happens maybe first through serving and then later through a connection in their own age group ministry. But a line was being drawn for me that they couldn't serve. And I just remember this being a barrier that was really frustrating, that me and the student pastor weren't connecting in a strategic way. And what I found over the years, that there's oftentimes animosity between a children's ministry and a student ministry. There's animosity about budget, about one ministry having more budget than the other, or maybe one ministry having more staff than the other, or maybe one ministry having better volunteers or better opportunities, or even better facilities, a better space, a better room, better equipment than the other ministry. And there's oftentimes this animosity between ministries where there's a lot of comparison that's happening, and maybe even jealousy that's happening between our ministries. And maybe that relates to you as well, because I remember feeling jealous about what our student pastor had that we didn't have. And oftentimes the way this plays out in churches all around the world is this passive-aggressive struggle between children's pastors and student pastors. And we don't really ever talk about it. We don't talk about it. We just kind of let it slide. But you can oftentimes cut the tension with a knife in your environments between the children's ministry and student ministry. Like there's no connection. There's very little relationship. And maybe they're amicable among each other, but they're very different. They don't connect outside of standard things that they should connect with. And oftentimes the children's ministry people see student people in a certain way. They may not communicate it, but this is how they feel. And in the same way, student ministry people see children's ministry people in a different way. And I'm just going to kind of name some of these things. This is probably pretty blunt, and this is definitely stereotypes, because not every children's pastor is this way, and not every student pastor is this way. But oftentimes we tend to find ourselves in stereotypes. A lot of children's pastors are very similar, and a lot of student pastors are also very similar, and that's probably because what it takes to be a successful student pastor requires certain makeup and skills and personality type, and so it's kind of makes sense that some of these stereotypes would seem to exist. And so here's actually what oftentimes some student pastor stereotypes. This is what oftentimes children's pastors think of student ministry people. They think that they're disorganized. They think that they're sloppy. Sometimes they think that they're lazy, that they wait to the last minute to do things and they don't clean up like they should or put things away. Sometimes they think that they're rebellious, that they're just young and empowered and they're going to do what they want to do. They use the phrase, it's better to ask forgiveness than to ask for permission. Or they seem reckless. And that's oftentimes the way that children's ministry people perceive student ministry people. But it goes the other way too. That oftentimes student ministry people look at the children's team and they have a different set of stereotypes that they tend to see. They see children's ministry people oftentimes as overprotective. They see them as rigid or hypersensitive or inflexible. Sometimes they see children's ministry people as just kind of nerdy or dorky. They just don't fit in. You just not seem to be in trend or what's current. And that's oftentimes the way that student ministry people see children's ministry people. And this animosity, there's definitely animosity between children's ministry and student ministry. There's sometimes jealousy, there's a comparison game, but it doesn't just exist between these two ministries. We often see it go across the church to other ministries as well, where the children's or student ministry might have animosity against the adults ministry, the adult Sunday school ministry or small groups ministry or missions or the choir or the band or even with the facilities team. There's this animosity between the children's ministry and student ministry exists to make the facilities people angry, make their life difficult. And there's this animosity all across the board. And we know this isn't right. And we see in the scripture here in Mark 3:24-25, it says this: if a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. If a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. We know better than this. We know that our ministries should connect better, that we should work together. And honestly, this divisiveness, this animosity, this is small-minded thinking. We're thinking too small. And this is why the church oftentimes, it fails to effectively win and disciple the next generation, because we're not working together. We're thinking small, okay? Now, when I first became aware of these barriers and became sensitive that there were things that I was running up against that were frustrating to me and that seemed limiting to me and helped me see the sense of the smallness of my ministry, I was about 8 years in to being a children's pastor. It would take another 3 or 4 years before I stumbled across a solution, a way of thinking differently, a way of thinking big. I was actually between jobs. I had just transitioned out of one children's ministry job, and I was interviewing at a church in Las Vegas. And it was at this church in Las Vegas that I was actually interviewing with a family ministry pastor. This was the first family ministry pastor I had ever met, somebody who oversaw kids through students. And I was interviewing for a children's pastor position at one of the campuses, and I wasn't quite sure about the position. I wasn't quite sure about the location. I wasn't quite sure about the church. But as I sat in this 2-hour interview with the family ministry pastor, I began to fall in love with something I didn't know existed. And when I finished the interview, I went to the hotel that we're staying in, and I went to go talk to my wife, and I told her, I don't want this job. I want that guy's job. Because what the role that this guy sat in as a family ministry pastor seemed to be a solution or an answer to the smallness that I felt of just being overseeing the children's ministry and being limited by the age and the time that I had with those kids. And here's an opportunity to look beyond just one ministry. Here's an opportunity to actually begin to think big. So about 6 months later, I actually found myself in a family ministry position, a next-gen position at Gateway Church in Austin, Texas, where I spent the next 8 years building a next-gen family ministry. And about a year ago, a little over a year ago, I transitioned out of that church and have been here in Gilbert, Arizona for the last year, building a next-gen team here at Mission Community Church. And I love it. It's been very exciting. And I throw this word around there, and some you might not have understood that word. I'm a next-gen pastor, a next-generation pastor. And what we mean by that word, or how that word is defined, is the person who oversees all ministry from birth through 12th grade, or birth through college. Sometimes it's young marrieds. But there's somebody who's looking at the strategy and the scope of all the age level development, the ministry that happens in those ages, and that's the role of the next-gen pastor. But a lot of churches don't have a next-gen pastor. Sometimes it's just a children's pastor and a student pastor, and they're having to figure out how do they better work together. There may not be a next-gen pastor, but they could have a next-gen strategy. They could be thinking bigger in the next-gen methodology. As a next-gen pastor, I don't oversee two teams necessarily, a kids team and a student team. I oversee one strategy. Now that might be defined by two teams, but we're all working together towards one end. Or I do know some next-gen pastors that actually do lead two teams, or they lead one integrated team where the children's ministry, student ministry are so integrated that it's not really a kids team or student team, but it really is a next-gen team. But regardless of whether your church has something like that or doesn't, you have a children's pastor, a student pastor, whether paid staff or volunteers, there is this idea of thinking bigger than just the ministry that you lead. Of actually thinking like a next-gen pastor, thinking next-gen, or even thinking big, okay? And so the term that I like to use for this is this idea of generational collaboration. Generational collaboration. How are we collaborating together for the next generation? How do multiple generations, or the people who oversee multiple spans of multiple generations, work together to help the next generation find a thriving, authentic faith that takes them well beyond college? And that's what we're looking for. So I'm going to read a scripture verse, and this is a very common verse. It's a little bit lengthy, so just hang in there with me, because I think that this verse really unpacks the heart of the matter of how we can begin to think big about our ministry, about how our ministry can become much bigger than it is. And I'm not talking about size and numbers, but the bigness of the impact we can have. So I'm going to read to you the very famous, very well-known passage from 1 Corinthians chapter 12. Starting in verse 12, and then I skip down a couple verses. But here goes. Just as the body, though one has many parts, but all its parts form one body, so it is with Christ. Now, if the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, it would not, for that reason, stop being part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But in fact, God has placed the parts of the body, every one of them, just as he wanted them to be. If they were all one part, where would the body be? And verse 20 says this, as it is, there are many parts, but one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you. And the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And the parts that we think are less honorable, we treat with special honor. And the parts that are unpresentable are treated with special modesty, while our presentable parts need no special treatment. But God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that it lacked, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. Okay, we know that passage. We've taught that passage to our kids, to our teenagers, and we've helped them to understand the diversity of humanity, of the church. And this is the verse that talks about all the different gifts and skills and personalities that God has put in the church to help lead the church. But isn't it interesting that the thing that plagues the church so often is the division of how different the children's pastor and the student pastor and the adults pastor, that we all tend to be, and we tend to lead these separated and segregated ministries. But all along, this is the passage that we've been teaching our congregations and we've been teaching our kids, and why haven't we taken note ourselves? You see, youth workers and children's workers are very different creatures. There's a reason why they serve with one age group, because they fit with that age group. You see, the student pastors, like their feet and children's people are ears, or their knees and their eyes. They're as different as they could possibly be, but that's okay, because that's how God created them, and that's the gifts and the personality and the connections that He gave them. Let me reread that last part of the passage here, because I feel like this is what really speaks to the truth of what we're experiencing in our ministries. But God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that it lacked, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. You see, too often in our ministries, we run them like islands. Like we just put our head down and we work on our thing, and we focus on our things. And we've even sometimes maybe deceived ourselves to thinking that if I just do my part as best as I possibly can, then I'm doing my job. I'm doing what I'm responsible for, and everything is okay, because if everyone does that, we'll all be okay. But we all know that even a basketball team made up of star players alone doesn't make it a great team. It's how they collaborate together. And I would say how they collaborate and work together is just as important as the skill sets that each player brings. You see, when one part suffers, the whole body suffers. And when one part wins, the whole wins. And so the same is true of our ministry, that if you're leading a children's ministry and your student ministry is struggling, that's your problem too. And if you're a student pastor and the children's ministry is just not up to snuff, it's not up to what it should be doing, that's your problem too. Because when one part suffers, the whole suffers with it. So I think maybe a good starting point in all of this is to really identify our differences. Our ministries are very different, and who we are and what we do and how we do them are different. So I know some of this is stereotypical, and here's the idea, that what I describe as a children's pastor, it may not be you. Or what I describe as a student pastor, that may not be you. But the truths are still the same, that how you're wired is different from the way that maybe somebody on another team is wired. And that's what I want to point to. So here's, again, this might be a little stereotypical, but it tends to be true from time to time because there are stereotypes within different areas of ministry. So student pastors, they oftentimes tend to be younger. Now, this is true in the United States. It's oftentimes the first gig for an aspiring pastor or campus pastor or whatever it may be. But oftentimes, student pastors, they tend to be young. It's kind of rare to find an older, lifelong student pastor. They just tend to be young people. They tend to be in tune with trends and styles. Because they're younger, they're trying to reach a younger generation, so it's important that they keep an idea of what music is in style, what clothes are in style, what hairstyles are in style. And so they tend to be in tune with those kinds of things. Oftentimes, student pastors, they tend to take risks. They tend to put themselves out there and do something, and to really mix it up and do something that's never been done before. They might drop a song that's been done for a short time because they want to try something new. They want to try something that's really in right now. Student people, they tend to be really fun. Like they create fun. They're looking for the event or the program that just brings a lot of joy and laughter and excitement to their ministry, because that really matters to the kids that they're leading. Because a lot of times the kids that they're leading, they can walk away. They don't have to show up. And so this is really important to them. Oftentimes student people, like, they tend to be masters of environments. That they create the right feel, the right environment because they know how important that is to students, because students, they don't have to be there. And so they tend to be very good at creating incredible environments. They also oftentimes tend to prioritize relationships. They're really good at relationships. They hang out at coffee shops with students, and they get to know them. They spend a lot of one-on-one time, or they do a good job of creating opportunities for leaders to have time with students. And so relationships are a huge deal for teenagers, which oftentimes may add to the stereotype that they're lazy or they're sloppy because they're spending so much time hanging out, being relational with their leaders or with students, that they're not taking care of some of the other things. But again, it's the way they're wired, okay? Now, let's look at the children's pastor. Let's look at the children's ministry worker. They tend to be more experienced, okay? It is actually very common to find somebody who's been serving in children's ministry for 20, 30, 40 years. That's actually a lot more common. Unlike in student ministry. And so because of the length of time that they've been serving, they tend to have a little bit more wisdom. And so they tend to think through things oftentimes a little bit better. Children's ministry people oftentimes tend to be more organized. They have a lot more to organize. They usually have multiple rooms and curriculum and multiple curriculums and tons of supplies and things that need to be saved and stored and things, and they tend to oftentimes be a little bit more organized. Children's people, they tend to think safety and security in mind, because oftentimes they're dealing with little kids and they've been entrusted with the young lives of little kids, and so they tend to think that, oh, that's not safe. This room is safe, it's protected, we've screened our people, and so they've done a good job of creating safe environments for kids. Children's ministry people, they tend to delegate better. And here's the thing, oftentimes a student ministry worker is one person speaking to a room of 20 people or 30 people or 40 people or 100 people, and you can utilize less leaders to minister to a greater number of kids. But in the children's ministry world, the children's pastor, the children's leader can only be in one place at a time, and so they have to delegate themselves because they have to fill 3 or 4 or 5 or 20 rooms of kids, and so they learn to delegate well, and maybe better than many student ministry people. And children's ministry people, they tend to think of families and parents just instinctively, because they also understand that parents have significant influence over kids. And so they tend to build better relationships with parents oftentimes than student ministry people. Sometimes student ministry people tend to have an animosity toward parents because they feel like the reason why I'm having to work so hard for your kid is because maybe something didn't happen right between you as a parent. So again, these are kind of stereotypes, but these are kind of the strengths and the characteristics and the qualities of a children's pastor or a student pastor. Now, here's where the problem lies. We oftentimes look at our counterpart and we judge them based on what they're not. Like, we see how organized we are and how safety-minded we are and how wise and experienced we are, and we judge our counterpart because they're not like us. In the same way, a student pastor might look at a children's pastor and judge them because they're not fun, and because they're not super relational, and because they're not stylish or they're not on trend, and so they judge them because they're not like they are. But don't you see, if we go back to that scripture verse in Corinthians, that an ear is not a foot, and a foot is not a mouth, and a nose is not a hand. And God's created us differently, and we shouldn't judge, because what makes a student pastor great at what they do is unique. And what makes a children's pastor great at what they do is unique. And so instead of saying, why are you so disorganized? Or why are you so rigid? Or you really need to grow up, that's thinking small. But thinking differently, thinking big, looks a lot different. You know, let's get super practical here. What if we thought differently? What if we thought bigger? Now, here's a couple ideas. What if the kids pastor spent time with a student pastor to help him get more organized? Wouldn't that be amazing? If you're a student pastor and you see how, frustrated maybe you get because of Excel spreadsheets and registration lists and things like that, and if someone else who is better at that than you came alongside you to help you with that, wouldn't that be a blessing? What if that happened? Or what if the student pastor helped the elementary leader rethink their environment to make it fun and relevant and fresh and new? Because that's what student pastors do so well. What if a kids person helped a student person develop better safety and security policies and procedures? Because they need it too. They actually need it as well. And that comes so natural to the kids person. What if a student person helped the kids person create a promotional video for an event that they have coming up? Or what if the kids person helped the student person better connect with parents, because oftentimes a student pastor is younger, and so they're not, maybe they're not parents yet, or they're still new into parenting, and they don't know how to connect with parents as well as you do. And what if you came alongside them and helped them better connect with parents? And you see, as you come together and help each other in your deficiencies, you're operating more like the body. You're operating more like you should be. I spent 12 years as a children's pastor before stepping into the next gen role that I lead now. And I remember after about 2 years of being a next gen pastor, we had to make a transition, and our student pastor had to lead the staff, and I had to lead the student ministry. And I remember being terrified because I had only known children's ministry. I'd led Next Gen for a couple of years, but I had a student pastor who was hands-on in the student ministry. And I remember being terrified because I didn't know students. I didn't know teenagers like I did kids. And after about the first week or two, I realized that there was far more in common with student ministry and children's ministry, that they're actually a lot more alike. And sometimes it's easy for us to look at the other ministry and see how different they are, and how unique they are, and how that's bad. But there's actually far more in common that we can work together and help each other out. Because here's the idea. Children's pastors and student pastors, they both lead volunteer organizations. They both depend on the success of leading volunteers to help influence kids. You know, most of our volunteers do the same thing. We have small group leaders in every age group. We have Sunday school teachers in every age group. We have communicators and worship leaders and greeters and behind the scenes volunteers. But we have so many of the same volunteer roles, and how we lead them may be almost identical. You know, most of our policies and procedures are the same, or they should be the same, of how we keep kids and teenagers safe. You know, our children's ministry is actually filled with teenagers. And so teenagers are a part of our children's ministry. And you know, kids from our children's ministry, they will grow up into the student ministry. We lead the same kids, just at different times in their lives. You know, we're serving the same families, sometimes at different phases of the kids' lives, and sometimes the same families because they have kids in two different phases. So we're all influencing the same kids. We honestly have far more in common than we actually have different. And here's this idea of working together. What if a children's pastor still had influence in the lives of the kids in their ministry after they left their ministry? Or what if a student pastor had a say in the ministry of the kids who were growing up into their ministry? Don't we see there's a priority, there's something important, that would be the definition of thinking big? If we were actually working more together and saw that we have a lot at stake, both of what happens after our ministry and what happens before our ministry, and what if we could actually work together? Now, as a next gen pastor at my church, I actually get to make my teams, my staff, work together in this way. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be that way. There may not be a next gen pastor at your church. You may just be a children's pastor or student pastor, and you can voluntarily come together and talk about what would it look like if we thought bigger about the next generation. What would it look like if we began to collaborate on some things together to have a bigger impact on the next generation? And I oftentimes, when I talk to children's pastors or student pastors who are leaning towards this, oftentimes it's met with a little bit of animosity of, I want to do this, but he doesn't. Or I want to do this, but she's resistant. And sometimes it might actually be having multiple conversations, or actually even inviting in a supervisor to help understand and understand the impact. It's not a control thing, it's not, but it's really about making a bigger impact for the next generation. You know, there's lots of different ways that we can strategically collaborate together. And I'm going to give you a couple examples. One of them might be around budgeting. I found over the 20 years of ministry that we oftentimes spend money in the same way. We tend to spend our money on the same things. And the bigger issue, though, is oftentimes I found that we never quite had the money that we needed to do what we really wanted to do. And the student ministry felt the same way. However, there were certain things that if we could combine our money together, that we might actually be able to do something together that we could never do separately. And so it might be that we could buy a resource or a product or a service that they could use one time, and then we could use it another time. And we found that there's actually lots of different ways that we could do that actually help together. So we began sitting down together to figure out how could we maybe spend our money strategically together to both have what we both really want. we look at the calendar. There's a lot to collaborate around on the calendar because sometimes just a random youth event might impact something that might hurt the children's ministry, or something that happens in children's ministry might impact the student ministry because there's students who volunteer in the children's ministry. And so we started sitting down about 7 or 8 years ago to begin calendaring together of how can we make sure that the events that we do collaborate and they synchronize and they actually support each other's events rather than compete against each other's events. Another way that you can collaborate is through volunteers. Again, like we talked earlier, that both ministries have many of the same volunteers who do the same kinds of things. And so we found that it was pretty inefficient for our student ministry to recruit small group leaders and hospitality volunteers and large group volunteers, while the children's ministry was recruiting small group leaders and hospitality volunteers and small group leaders. Like, it didn't make sense that we're both independently recruiting the same exact volunteers. And we began to decide that what if we did this together? Because even the process of recruiting and onboarding and training and screening, what if people who enjoyed that better could do that for both ministries and then just place people based on what age group they were a better fit for? And so we began actually recruiting. So no longer did our student ministry recruit independently or children's ministry recruit independently, but we actually recruited together and we put the best people in the best fit for where they wanted to be. But we just recruited as small group leaders, or we just recruited hospitality volunteers and looked at what times and days that they were available, and that would oftentimes determine what ministry they served in. So how we recruited, trained, and developed actually ended up leading that direction. Even the way we lead small groups. We found that what actually works better for a small group is that if a small group leader could actually move up with their kids as they promoted through the years. And one of the biggest transitions that challenges us here in the United States is when a kid leaves elementary school, primary school, grade school, and they go into middle school or junior high, there's a big transition there. There's a big drop off. And we found that if we could recruit a volunteer small group leader who would at least transition with them between elementary school and middle school, or elementary school and junior high, then we had a far greater chance of retaining that kid in the ministry and in church than if we did it another way. And so it made us cause that how we trained and recruited and defined small group leaders was important, that it was the same in both ministry areas. And the culture of our ministry areas had to look alike, but that it couldn't be too different, otherwise the volunteers wouldn't transition from one area than the other. There's all kinds of ways that we can collaborate together, that we can work together, and we can begin thinking bigger than we think now. Because the ministry that we lead is small. But when you consider your ministry and the ministry that comes before your ministry and the ministry that comes after your ministry, and when we begin to collaborate and work together, then we're thinking big. And it doesn't just involve the generational ministries of children's ministry and student ministry. It actually expands to other ministries as well. We found a couple years ago when I was at Gateway in Austin that that we had to begin partnering beyond just our generational ministries. That there's actually a really amazing connection between our Next Gen team and our arts and production and worship team. That we're always looking for worship leaders, and we're always looking for hosts and storytellers. And oftentimes the adult ministries, the adult arts, worship, and production ministries would host auditions and trainings where there would be people who auditioned for a singing role or a production role that maybe they weren't quite the right fit for our main adult production, but they were more than enough for our children's ministry. They were more than enough for our preschool, or more than enough for our high school or junior high. And we actually ended up finding that partnering with our adult arts worship production ministry actually opened the door for far more volunteers than we ever were going to be able to get on our own. But then what it also did for them was it created a training space for people with talent that needed a little bit more time to hone their talent, that oftentimes many of our volunteers who sang or danced or worshiped or led production would sometimes get picked to move back into the adult auditorium when they needed somebody new in that area. And so there ended up becoming this really beautiful collaboration between our arts team and our Next Gen team that created something beautiful. Another area was in our missions department. We had this desire to send teenagers and kids on mission trips all around our city, our state, and our country, and even the world. But we didn't have the capacity and the know-how to send 100 or 200 teenagers on all these mission trips. But we had a mission department at our church that was underutilized, that didn't have enough people to send on mission trips. And so we sat down and began to collaborate. What would it look like for there to be a joint operation between our missions department and our next gen department? And we ended up, over a period of a couple years, began mobilizing over 200 teenagers and kids on mission trips all around the country. And it became such a huge success for our missions team, but also it did something for the next generation that was powerful, that you can't replicate on a Sunday morning or a midweek service. And so sometimes it means sitting down with other leaders within your ministry and collaborating and thinking bigger and thinking about the next generation in a way that thinks beyond where you are now, because that really matters. So how all of this is implemented in your ministry may look very different from the way it's implemented in my ministry. And that's really not the point. It doesn't have to look the same. It doesn't have to be a cookie cutter, just like what I do is what you do. But it's actually figuring out how you can collaborate better, how you can gather more people around the table to talk about the next generation. Because if the best measure of success, of the impact of our ministry, are the kids who found faith in our church when they were kids or teenagers, still walking with their faith at age 25, that's the true measure. What does it take for us to make that happen? And it takes thinking big. See, here's the thing. You're never going to have the resources that you need to impact the generation the way that you want. But if you collaborate with others, other ministries, other departments, you'll have more than you have on your own. You'll never have the people, enough volunteers, enough staff to have the impact on the next generation that you need. But if you collaborate and coordinate with others, you'll have more than you have now. And you'll never have the time. The time that we have is far too short. But when we collaborate with others and the ministries that come before us and the ministries that come after us, then we actually lengthen the time that we have, and we have more than we would have on our own. You see, how this is implemented in your ministry may look different than the way it's implemented in my ministry. But the big idea here is to begin thinking bigger, to begin collaborating with other ministries and coordinating in ways that we can do that. What matters is that you're thinking different. And what matters is that you're thinking bigger than you think right now. And maybe if you begin to think bigger than you are now, then maybe your church will start thinking bigger and different than it is now. And that's what the next generation needs. To find and follow Christ beyond their adult years is when we think big. We think before us, and we think after us, and we invest in the next generation in a coordinated way. And that's what the next generation needs. Let me pray for you guys as we close this up. Father, I thank you so much for all those that got to be a part of this talk. And Lord, I just pray over their ministries as they oversee a kids ministry or student ministry. And I pray that you would begin to help them see bigger than they see now. Lord, that they may feel limited, they may feel and sense the barriers of where their ministry meets up with the next ministry or the ministry that comes before them. And Lord, I pray that conversations will begin to happen where they would begin to connect with other ministries. They begin to connect with the influences who influence who comes before and after them. And together they could collaborate and do something bigger than they did before. Because God, you created them uniquely as you did their counterparts. And Lord, I pray that there would be a sense of unity and collaboration, that together they could do far greater than they ever did on their own. So Lord, I pray that you give them persistence to lean in to those who maybe are leaning away, that you would give them the words to speak, to influence, because this generation needs something bigger than we've been able to give it so far. I thank you for this. Lord, I pray that this would create new ideas and new thoughts and new strategies so we can reach and disciple and love the next generation the way that you want us to. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Thank you guys so much.